A mi sada odlazimo još jednom u Vatikan, tamo nas i dalje čeka Nina Kljenak. Nina, ovaj put u tvom društvu je, možemo reći, sasvim slobodno ekskluzivan gost. Riječ je o Philu Savianu, čovjeku po čijem je svjedočanstvu čak snimljeni film. Izvoli.
Da, Marko, sa mnom je Phil Saviano, čovjek koji je donio sve materijale Boston Globu i na temelju kojih materijala je i počela istraga grupe koja se naziva Spotlight i koja je dovela do toga da se optuži više od 90 svećenika u Bostonu i oko Bostona, te otkrije više od 1000 djece koja su bila zlostavljanja. Jedan od njih je bio i Phil. Sad ćete zajedno sa mnom čuti, spreman je progovoriti o svemu detaljno za N1 televiziju. Hi Phil, welcome and thank you for joining me.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks.
Okay, let's start with the beginning because you told me that I can ask any question.
Anything you want.
How did it start and what happened when you were like 11 and 12 and also you brought here a picture of how you looked when everything happened?
Yeah. Well, I lived in a small town in Massachusetts. And I was the newspaper boy. I delivered newspapers, and the rectory was one of my customers. I came from a very Catholic Italian family, and what I discovered when I first met this priest was that he had the unusual characteristic of bringing his personality down to the level of us children. He told a lot of jokes. He knew a lot of card tricks. He paid attention to both myself and my best friend, who was an altar boy at the time. And I remember feeling at first very fortunate that this man who was so well respected, who had the power to, forgive sins, perform the miracles at Mass, changing the wine into the blood of Christ, was paying attention to me. And I thought, this is really great. But what I didn't realize was that I was entering into a situation that was going to turn out to be disastrous. Because very slowly he got to know me, he got to know about my family, about my school, about my friends. The first sign that there were going to be problems was that one day when he was going to show us some card tricks, the deck of cards he had suddenly had pornographic pictures on them. And I remember both my friend and I, instead of running out of the church, which we should have done, we were curious about these pictures because we'd never seen anything like that before. And that was the beginning, because by him showing us these pictures, he said, you can't tell anybody, this is a secret between you and me. And that made us feel even more special. But what we didn't know was that from the pictures was going to come sexual abuse. And at the worst of it, which went on for over a year, there was many instances where my friend and I, sometimes together, sometimes each of us individually, were forced to perform masturbation on him, perform oral sex on him. It was frightening, it was disgusting, but because of the power that he had over us, we couldn't figure out how to stop it. There would be an instance where I would say to the priest, I can't stay here, I can't do this, I'm going to be late for supper, I have to get back to my paper, and I would try to walk away and he would grab me by my wrist and he would pull me back. He would not take no for an answer, and because of the power differential, I never had it within me to yell at him, to kick him or hit him. He was God's representative in my little town. And I didn't have the power to say no to God at that level. And so months went by, and there were numerous instances in the church, upstairs in the main part of the church, in the basement, in the rectory, where I was assaulted over and over again. I never felt at the time that I could go to my parents for help. I felt that somehow I would be blamed for it. And I worried that my father would be so angry that he would go down to the rector and he would punch that priest, but then the whole town would find out about it. And I knew a lot of people because I was the newspaper boy, and it would be so embarrassing for me that all my people in the neighborhood knew that had happened. So I kept quiet about it. And after 18 months, the priest left suddenly. The kids never knew where he went. And I, as the years went by, I assumed that he had been caught and he had been removed from the priesthood and that he was no longer putting children at risk. And the reason I thought that, because when I was 11 and 12, his behavior was so outrageous. He was very compulsive. It's like he didn't have any control over himself, it seemed. And I thought, oh, sure, he's going to get caught. I don't have to worry about it. Well, then when I turned 40 in 1992, there's a little story in the Boston newspaper about these two men in the state of New Mexico, the other side of the country, who said that in the 1970s, 10 years after my own experience, they too had been molested by a priest who was also from Massachusetts. And I sat there and I read that story and I realized it was the same priest as mine. And for me, that was a life-changing moment, because I realized, and this still makes me emotional, but I realized that no one in the church had ever stopped that priest. The story also said that in the 1980s, he had served in parishes in Texas, and in that year, 1992, he was in Denver, Colorado. So I felt it was important to go public with my story, and I contacted the Boston Globe and I decided to sit down and do an interview.
We will arrive to the Boston Globe. Just tell me, how can a little boy cope with something that we can almost call like spiritual dilemma? Because at some point, even in the movie, you say, how can I say no to God? Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. The impact on a child is emotional, psychological, but there's a very important spiritual impact as well. And for me, I came from a very Catholic family. I had made my first communion. I was go to confession every couple of weeks, and I had this dilemma because I thought this behavior must be sinful. It must be a mortal sin. I couldn't figure out which of the 10 commandments would this come under, but I knew it had to be serious, and I felt that I had to confess it, because I thought, I'm riding my bicycle every day all through the neighborhood, and if I got hit by a car or something without confessing this, that I was in trouble. But the dilemma for me was that my confessor was also my abuser. So I was forced to go to confession to the same priest who was sexually assaulting me. And that was a dilemma, because I felt like if I said that in confession, I was going to be accusing him of being sinful as well. How would he react? So I came up with a plan. I went in and I kneeled before the screen and I said, "Bless me, Father, I have sinned, and these are my sins." And as a 12-year-old, what are your sins? Maybe you yelled at your mother, or maybe I hit my little brother because he was bugging me, or silly, insignificant things. But then I said to him, I leaned into the window and I said, "And you know the rest." And there was silence from the other side of that screen. He didn't say, "What are you talking about?" He knew what I was talking about. But he didn't address it. He just said, "Well, your penance is say 3 Our Fathers and 3 Hail Marys." So I left the confession booth. I went to the front of the church and kneeled down in front of the altar, and I said those prayers as quickly as I could, because I wanted to get out of the church before he was through hearing confession, because I didn't want him to be able to come after me. And that was my life as a 11 and 12-year-old. I will give you another example. This shows how compulsive he was. I had to walk to school every day, every morning, going by the church and by the rectory. And I remember one morning I'm out on the street. He's in the second floor bedroom of the rectory, and he's calling out to me as I'm walking by. And I'm thinking to myself, what does he want now? And I couldn't quite hear what he was saying, but I'm looking, and he's standing behind the curtain in the window, and I realize that what he's doing is he's masturbating as I'm walking by going to school. And the first thing that I thought of was, oh my God, what if one of the neighbors sees this? I'm going to get in trouble. That was my state of mind. I didn't want anybody to know about it. and somehow I felt that I'm the blame here. It was very, very confusing at a very young age for me.
Did he steal your faith, or you still believe in God?
No, I don't believe in God. And you know what happened was that, so I had my first crisis of faith. That whole confessional thing was a crisis of faith for me at the age of 12. But once you start thinking in those lines, once you start doubting the teachings and so on, it puts you on a path that ends up with you rejecting your religion, specifically Catholicism. And now I consider myself an agnostic. I won't go so far as to say I'm an atheist, but I don't believe in the Catholic Church. I only go to Mass on special family occasions, weddings, funerals. So
I do get the point. At some point you decided, not at some point, but when you saw what was going on in New Mexico, right?
Yeah.
Then you decided to approach to the Boston Globe.
Yeah,
the first time and then the second time, right?
Yeah. So the first time was in 1992 when I told, the first time I ever told my story publicly. And they ran the story on the front page, and the Associated Press picked it up, so that it ran in newspapers in all the states where that priest had been assigned. And the response from the Worcester Diocese was that we're really surprised to hear this. We never had any problems with him. I thought, how can that be? Nobody knew all these years? So I contacted a lawyer, and he advised me, he says, the way to find out is if you file a civil lawsuit, then you can get access to his personnel file. I did that, and what I found was that over the course of his career, at least 6 bishops in 4 states knew that he was a child molester. In fact, he had been caught so many times that he was sent to 4 different church-run psychological treatment centers. But after his treatment program was over, they always put him back in a new assignment, back in a new parish. And when I learned that, I was so angry. It was so unnecessary. You know, the abuse that the children went through in New Mexico and in Texas, it could have been prevented if they had handled him properly in Massachusetts. But that sort of, you know, that fueled my activism. And I started a New England chapter of the organization called SNAP. I started holding support group meetings for other victims. I started doing a lot of radio and TV interviews and trying to get the word out. And what I found was that the newspapers, particularly the Boston Globe, were willing to report on individual priests, but they weren't willing to say, well, what about the bishop? What did the bishop know? And how was it that this priest was in so many different parishes where he molested, you know, one kid after another kid after another kid? And so finally in 1998, I sent a packet of documents and a letter to the Globe with documents from not only my case but a few other cases, including a case of a priest from Ohio that had molested children in Ohio but then was accepted into the Boston Archdiocese where he continued to molest kids. And I said to these 2 Globe reporters, one was an investigative reporter, one was the religion editor, I said, this is what's going on. I think you should take a look at it. I think there's a big story here. But at that time, they were reluctant to look into it. One of the reporters called me and said, this is very interesting, but our editor wants to know, do you have any evidence that this is going on today? Because some of these letters go back to the 1970s and the 1980s. I said, well, I don't have specific evidence, but I have no reason to believe that it's not going on. But that's why I gave this information to you, because you guys are investigators. And the response was, well, our editor thinks this is old news and we're not interested in looking into it.
And then in 2001 and 2002, everything changed.
Yeah, because what changed was that in the summer of 2001, the Boston Globe hired a new editor. And it was a man named Marty Barron from Florida. And he came up to Boston, and he didn't have any allegiances to anybody in Boston. He was also Jewish. And the very first week he was there, as it showed in the Spotlight movie, he said to his reporters, what's wrong with you guys? Why aren't you looking into this issue? And so I got my first phone call from Walter Robinson, who was the head of the Spotlight team. And what's interesting is that the priest that he asked me about in that very first phone call was one of the priests that I had written to them about a couple years before. So we had a total of 3 conversations over a few days, and then they invited me in for that meeting, which is shown in the movie. In real life, that meeting went on for over 3 hours, and it was for me, a very, very powerful experience, because I really felt for the first time that a group of reporters that really had the ability to get the word out and facilitate some change were taking me seriously and were interested in what I had to say. And I remember sitting there talking, and the reporters are sitting in a circle around me, and I'm talking and I'm looking, and everybody's taking notes. I thought, it took a long time to get here, but thank God I'm finally being listened to.
And Phil, what has changed since Boston Globe has published those testimonies of the abused?
Well, a lot of things have changed in the United States. There was quite an uproar in the year 2002, because not only many victims in Boston, but also in other parts of the United States came forward. And the American bishops established a series of rules, which we refer to as the Dallas Charter for the Protection of Children. And they did have some good rules in the sense that they had a zero tolerance policy. You know, first time you're caught abusing a child is the last time, because we're pulling you out. But it was also weak in a couple of important ways. There were no consequences for bishops who were abusers or bishops who protected these priests and moved them around. No consequences for the bishops, and that's a big problem. The other problem with that is that it was just for the United States. There were no regulations for the rest of the world. And what we've learned since then is that this is a worldwide problem. And in countries, you know, like Mexico, perhaps in your country.
I will give you an example, and I will ask you a question. Okay. So would you agree with me if I say in US, people who were abused, they have a voice, right? They have SNAP, they have a voice, they have your voice. In Croatia, that is like 85% Catholic country, is still kind of, well, there is a culture of silence, which is kind of higher and powerful, more powerful than in US. What to do? How to break, how to end the culture of silence?
Well, in my experience, you have to, the way it generally works is somebody has to have the courage to come forward. And usually, when that first person speaks out, it gives courage to other people. And like in my case, when I spoke out, then other victims from my part of the United States started speaking out about the same priest. And then other people started speaking out about other priests in Massachusetts. So it's kind of like, the hard part is getting it started. And you have social media there. I think that if there is a victim that can somehow, maybe anonymously, without revealing his or her name, get a message out there looking for other victims of the same priest, if they can connect with each other, form a little network of power of their own, and then 2 or 3 of them go public, that I think would have a really dramatic impact, and it would show that other survivors, it is possible to speak out about this. The other thing that's important to know is it is possible to have this experience as a child and to grow up and still have a happy life and not let the abuse completely, you know, destroy you.
Let's talk about what is going on right now. We have here Papal Abuse Summit. Yep. Do you think that it's possible that like winds of change whistled through the Vatican that is here right behind your back?
The phrase that I've been using is called a tipping point. It's a cultural tipping point where things build up and build up and build up, and finally it just topples over and the winds of change do come in. I don't know if that's what's happening, but I'm more optimistic than I have been in a long time. I was one of the survivors that met with the organizers of the summit the other day, and I was pleasantly surprised that they were willing to engage in a very frank discussion. There was a lot of back and forth exchange of information. The other thing is, I don't know if you're aware, but I read and presented a letter to Archbishop Cicluna, who had been talking about the importance of transparency, the importance of ending the secrecy, which is what we're calling for, you know? And I thought, well, okay, then I'm going to see how serious he is about this. And I read the letter at the meeting, and much to my surprise, at the end of the meeting, he pulled me aside for a private conversation. He said, you know, you raised some very important points. I agree with what you're saying about transparency. You called for the Vatican files of priests who are abusers to be released, for the names to be released, for the assignment histories of these priests to be released. And he says, I think that's a good idea. Now, he's not the Pope. He can't release them on his own, but I know he has the Pope's attention. He can sit down with the Pope and say, you know, you should think about this.
Well, Pope said yesterday it's enough with kind of, you know, condemns and prayers. We need something concrete, right? Yeah. You know that there won't be a document. There will be like a final speech. But what do you expect from this summit?
Well, my understanding is that the main purpose for this summit was to bring bishops in the parts of the world where there aren't a lot of victims speaking up, bring them up to speed as far as what this is all about, how victims should be treated with respect and believed, how abusive priests should be pulled out of service, because they told us at this meeting that there are many bishops, particularly in the southern hemisphere, Mexico, for example. It has the largest population of Catholics in the world. And yet the bishops there can say, well, we don't have that problem. We don't have any survivors speaking up. It's not that the problem does not exist. It's that the survivors have not found their voices. But I think, thanks to news coverage like this, thanks to social media, thanks to that Spotlight movie, we're seeing that more and more victims are coming forward. Chile is a perfect example. You know, Chile is another very, very Catholic country. And up until very recently, no survivors were willing to come forward. And now there's been dozens of them. And it's created an uproar, but it's also created an example for victims in other countries of South America to look to and to follow.
And the last question, do you think that this Pope has strength and power actually to do a meaningful change? You know why? Because like you know what is going on in Vatican too, and I've been following Vatican. There are so many priests and very powerful men who are basically against the way in which Pope Francis rules this huge organization, right?
Exactly the way they've been for the last 1,000 years. And that is one of my questions about the Pope. Is he powerful enough to make these needed changes on his own? Or is he going to be be facing these people and say, no way, we're not doing this? He has to be a leader, but he also has to be have a powerful enough personality to convince the opposition that this is the way that the church has to go now. So I don't know what the answer is going to be. I can tell you that I'm more optimistic than I have been in a long time. I don't think when this summit ends we're going to all of a sudden be presented with new rules. I think they're going to continue to have other meetings. They talk about having more dialogue with survivors as well, which is important. But I do feel that they're starting to head in the right direction. And I also know that if they don't, at least in my country, the United States, Catholics are so angry at this point. Many of them are leaving the church, pulling their children out of parochial schools, stopping the donations, and the other change is that now the law enforcement officials, the attorney generals, are going after the church as well. That's never happened before. And I think to a certain degree that's one of the things that's pushing the Pope and pushing the Vatican forward in making these changes.
Phil, thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you for your honesty, and thank you for joining me.
You're very welcome, and hello to your audience.
Thank you.